At the family dinner, I took my seat at the table with a broken arm. I couldn't even hold a fork, so I sat there hungry. The guests were silent. My daughter, Sierra, spoke softly. My husband taught her a lesson. My son-in-law, Marcus, let out a proud laugh. The old woman thought she was in charge here, but I proved her wrong. I merely smiled. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. When Marcus opened it, he found out who was really in charge. Friends, before we dive into this story, I want to ask for a small favor. If what you hear resonates with your heart, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're listening from. It always warms my spirit to see how vast our community is. Happy listening. The scent of roasted duck with apples, thick and oily, hung in the air like a haze. For anyone else, this aroma would promise a holiday feast, a symbol of comfort and family warmth. But for me, sitting at the head of the table in my own dining room, it was just a stark reminder of my helplessness. I looked at my plate. Fine bone white china, trimmed with gold, part of the set my late husband and I bought in New York City 40 years ago. The plate was empty, flawlessly clean, and empty. To my right, where my dominant hand should have rested, was a heavy, clumsy plaster cast. It was cold, an alien like a stone strapped to my body. The swelling beneath the cast felt compressive. Every beat of my heart sent a dull, throbbing ache through my forearm, climbing up to my shoulder. My distal radius was fractured with displacement. I knew it even before I saw the X-ray. I'd heard the crunch, a dry, sickening sound like a brittle branch snapping when Marcus shoved me against the doorframe. Well, folks, don't be shy. Dig in. Marcus's voice, loud and possessive, boomed across the room, drowning out the clinking of silverware. The duck today is just amazing. Sierra outdid herself. Marcus sat in my husband's place in the high-backed chair, upholstered in dark velvet. He unbuttoned his jacket, the color of wet asphalt. His face was already glistening from the heat and the alcohol he'd consumed. He wielded his knife and fork with a brutal energy, cutting large chunks of meat and shoveling them into his mouth, barely chewing. Grease dribbled down his chin, and he carelessly wiped it with the back of his hand. Around the table sat his guests, 2 men and 1 woman, subordinates from his city planning department. They ate in silence, eyes glued to their plates. They sensed the tension hanging in the air, thick as an electric charge before a storm. They saw me, an aging black woman with a straight back and a plaster-clad limb, with not a single crumb of food before her. But they feared him. Marcus was their assistant director, a petty kingpin, whose signature determined their bonuses and vacations. I tried to flex the fingers of my left hand. They obeyed, but lifting the heavy dish of duck sitting in the center of the table was impossible. It was too far and my good side couldn't reach. Marcus, one of the guests, a young man in glasses named Sam, whispered quietly, not daring to look up. Maybe we should serve Dr. Ashworth. Stay out of it, Sam, Marcus interrupted, pouring himself another shot of vodka. The bottle clinked against the crystal glass rim. Dr. Ashworth is on a diet today. Therapeutic fasting is very good for clearing the mind, right, Mama? He looked at me. In his eyes, murky with vodka, there wasn't an ounce of remorse. Only triumph. The triumph of a predator who had finally cornered the old lioness and was now savoring her infirmity. Mama has only herself to blame, Sierra chimed in. My daughter sat to her husband's left. She was wearing a beige dress that did nothing for her, making her face look pale and exhausted. Sierra meticulously sliced a cucumber into small pieces, avoiding my gaze. She knows she's got the age factor now. Marcus continued, addressing the guests as if telling a joke. Her coordination is shot. Legs get tangled up. She went climbing up to the high closet shelf yesterday. Can you believe it? I told her. What are you doing, old woman? But she wouldn't listen. So she tumbled down, lucky she didn't break her neck. He burst into rough laughter. The guests forced out polite, strained smiles. I looked at my daughter. For 30 years, I was a practicing neurosurgeon. I had seen the human brain with my own eyes. I knew where memory hid, where speech resided, and where fear lived. But I couldn't recall the moment in my memory when I lost my daughter, when she turned into this shadow, this echo of her pathetic husband. It was an accident, Sierra said softly, finally raising her eyes to mine. There was fear splashing in them. Not for me, for herself. But it was a necessary lesson. Mama, you need to learn to listen to the head of the house. You're not at work here. You don't command anyone. My stomach cramped with hunger. I hadn't eaten for almost 24 hours, not since the moment Marcus, demanding the deed to the condo, had thrown me in the hallway. The pain in the broken bone pulsed in rhythm with the ticking of the antique German grandfather clock standing in the corner. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was my father's clock. It always kept perfect time. Marcus raised his shot glass. To discipline, he declared, there must be order and hierarchy in the house. The one who pays the bills calls the shots, and the one who lives by charity should sit quietly and not make a scene. He tossed the vodka down his throat, grunted, and stabbed a pickled mushroom with his fork. I felt a coldness rising inside me, deep beneath my ribs, replacing the hurt. It was a familiar feeling, the same icy calm that descended when I walked into the operating room when the anesthesiologist nodded. Patient ready? And I took the scalpel into my fingers. Emotions are noise. Anger is tremor. I needed steadiness. I didn't cry. Tears are for those who hope for pity. I had no such hope. I knew. I shifted my gaze to the clock face. The hands moved relentlessly forward. 7:59 p.m. A silence hung in the room, broken only by Marcus's chewing. He felt victorious. He thought he had broken me, along with my bone. He thought this cast was the symbol of my defeat. I straightened my back as much as the pain would allow and took a deep breath. Marcus. My voice was quiet but distinct. It cut through the thick dining room air like a surgical instrument. Marcus froze with the fork halfway to his mouth. The guest stopped chewing. Even Sierra stood still. What do you want? He grumbled without turning around. You're sitting in my husband's chair, I stated, looking straight at the back of his head. And by my calculations, you have exactly 1 minute left to enjoy it. Marcus slowly turned, his face flushed red, his lips twisting into a sneer. What? He asked, and a threat crept into his voice. Are you threatening me, Ashworth, or what? Going to hit me with your cast? He laughed, a coarse barking sound that echoed off the high ceiling. Oh, I'm so scared, he mocked, addressing the guests. Look, she's timing me. Go ahead, count it down. 59 seconds. 58. I didn't answer. I just watched the second hand, which, trembling slightly, approached the vertical line. I knew what he didn't. I knew that the mechanisms I had put in motion worked just as precisely as this clock. Marcus didn't know that the silence in this condo was not submission. It was the countdown. The second hand completed its final sweep, and precisely as it touched the top mark, the pain in my arm flared with renewed intensity, as if carrying me back in time, exactly 24 hours ago. That evening, the air in this condo didn't smell of roast duck. It was saturated with the sour scent of fear and stale liquor. Marcus was pacing the living room, stumbling into corners. He looked like a cornered rat, sweaty with darting eyes and shaking hands. I need the money, you old witch, he screamed, spitting saliva. Do you even understand the kind of numbers I'm on the hook for? This isn't a joke. These are serious people. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom, blocking his path. This is my husband's condo. I replied calmly then. And as long as I'm alive, it will not be sold to cover your gambling debts. It was a mistake, not the refusal. No, the mistake was thinking that the person in front of me was still a human being. In that moment, the human in Marcus finally gave way to the animal terror of his creditors. He lunged at me. I saw his dilated pupils, his bloodshot eyes. The blow was sudden and unexpectedly strong for such a soft man. He didn't just push me. He threw me with his full weight like useless trash. I flew backward. My right arm instinctively went up to protect my face from hitting the door frame. Crunch. I would recognize that sound out of 1,000. The dry, sickening snap of bone breaking. In that same second, the world narrowed to a single point in my form. A hot wave of nausea rose in my throat. I slid down the wall onto the hardwood floor, clutching my unnaturally bent wrist to my chest. Sierra stood in the hallway. She saw everything. She saw the wind-up. She saw the impact. She heard the crunch, but she didn't rush to me. She merely pressed her palms to her cheeks and whispered, "Mama, why do you have to provoke him? Just sign the papers." Marcus, breathing heavily, hovered over me. "See?" he hissed. "Your fault. Tripped. You old fool." He lunged for the phone on the side table and violently ripped the cord from the wall. Then he snatched the cell phone from my house coat pocket. "No calls," he snarled. "You sit here and think. The notary comes tomorrow. If you don't sign nicely, I'm checking you into a psych ward. I'll tell them you're violent. I have my people everywhere. You know that." He slammed the bedroom door and turned the key in the lock. I was left alone in the dark on the floor, with an arm on fire. But Marcus, for all his scheming, was just a small-time bureaucrat. He knew how to steal budgets meant for municipal repairs, but he knew nothing about the people of my generation, and he certainly forgot who I was before I became a useless old woman. I am a surgeon. Panic is a luxury a surgeon cannot afford. Overcoming the pain that made my vision dim, I crawled toward the old linen cabinet. With my left hand, I felt around on the bottom shelf for a worn leather medical bag. My emergency kit. It hadn't held scalpels for years, but it contained things that could save a life in other ways. An ampoule of painkiller, a syringe, and an old flip phone that I charged once a month out of habit. I gave myself the injection. With trembling fingers, I put the battery into the phone. The screen lit up with a dim greenish glow. Service was available. Who to call? 911? Useless. The local police chief drinks with Marcus every Sunday at the private club. They are bound by a small circle of corruption. My call would simply be intercepted, and Marcus would become even more aggressive. I needed someone who stood above this filth, someone for whom the laws of this district were meaningless. I closed my eyes. Memory helpfully brought up a combination of digits I hadn't dialed in exactly 20 years. I never wrote that number in an address book. Such numbers are only kept in the head. Ring. Second ring. Third. Speaking. A man's voice answered. A calm, low, authoritative voice, not used to repeating itself. "It's Alice," I said. My voice trembled, not from fear, but from the shock of the pain. "I need help." A silence hung on the line. It lasted only a second, but decades passed within it. "Where are you?" he asked. "No." "How are you?" "No, it's been years." Only instant readiness for action. A soldier's reflex. I gave him the address. "Wait." A sharp ring at the door tore me from my memories, returning me to the stuffy dining room. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times. The sound of the doorbell was unlike a normal chime. It was a long, insistent, demanding signal that rattled the glass in the china cabinet. Marcus flinched, but immediately broke into a smug grin. He wiped his greasy lips with a napkin and unsteadily rose from his chair. "There. he proclaimed triumphantly, addressing the hushed guests. And you were worried? Punctuality? The courtesy of kings? Yes, Dr. Ashworth. He looked down at me. His eyes glittered with the anticipation of easy profit. It's the attorney he explained, winking at the guests. I called him specifically for 8 o'clock. We'll just process a little paperwork, a formality, family matters, and then we'll continue the feast. Sierra sighed with relief and reached for her glass of wine. Thank God, she murmured. Mama, please just sign. Don't make a scene. I didn't reply. I only gripped the armrest of my chair tighter with my left hand. The effect of the painkiller I had injected yesterday had long worn off, but now the adrenaline muted any sensation. Marcus, swaying and humming something under his breath, headed to the foyer. I heard his heavy steps receding down the hallway, heard the lock click.
Come in.
Come in, dear friend. His voice, full of false geniality, rang.
Out.
We've been waiting for you. I hope the papers are ready. We have a little old woman being difficult, but we— Marcus' voice cut off mid-sentence. Not faded, but snapped as if someone had blocked his airway. The dining room fell silent. The guests exchanged glances. Sierra froze with the glass at her mouth. I looked at the empty doorway leading into the corridor. I knew what was about to happen. Marcus thought he was opening the door to his accomplice, a pathetic shire who, for a few thousand, would legalize any theft. He was so confident in his impunity, in his small, pathetic power over an old woman who was supposedly losing her mind. But he opened the wrong door. He opened it not to a notary, but to his judgment. Instead of a greeting, a deathly silence hung in the hallway. It was so dense it seemed as if the air in the condo had been instantly vacuumed out. And then I heard a sound that made my heart beat slightly faster. The heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots on the hardwood floor. These were not the shuffling steps of an attorney. This was the gate of power. I couldn't see what was happening at the front door, but I heard Marcus's breathing catch, turning into a wheezing hiss. Governor Sterling. My son-in-law's voice, which had been thundering through the condo a minute ago, now sounded thin and pitiful like a scolded schoolboy. Governor Sterling. Stupefaction reigned at the table. The guests froze with forks in hand. The woman from the department dropped a piece of duck onto the tablecloth but didn't even notice. The name Marcus had uttered was too grand for our dining room. It was the name of a man whose portraits hung in their offices above their heads. A man who decided the fate of the entire region with a single stroke of his pen. What an honor! Marcus babbled in the hallway. I heard him backing away. We weren't prepared. If I had known, you would grace us with a visit. It's just a family dinner, Governor Sterling. We're— Just two figures appeared in the dining room doorway. They weren't guests. They were mountains. Two huge men in black tactical gear without insignia but with a military bearing that no clothing could conceal. They silently stood on either side of the entrance, scanning the room with cold, indifferent eyes. Marcus rushed into the room, walking backward and bowing to someone invisible. In the hallway, his face was the color of spoiled milk. Please come in. Come in, he fussed, bumping into chairs. Sierra, stand up.
Ghosts, stand. It's
the governor himself. And then he walked into the room. William Sterling had aged over the past 20 years. His hair had gone completely gray, and the wrinkles around his eyes were deeper, like scars, left by time and responsibility. But they were the same eyes, steely, intelligent, seeing right through a person. He was dressed in an impeccable gray suit that fit him perfectly, emphasizing the broad shoulders of a former soldier. But the strangest thing was not his appearance. The strangest thing was in his hands, in his massive palms. Accustomed to holding weapons and signing executive orders, he carefully clutched a small, modest bouquet of wild blue irises, bright blue against the strict gray fabric. Marcus, trembling all over, tried to block his path, extending a sweaty hand for a handshake. Governor Sterling, allow me. I'm Marcus Thorne, Assistant Director of Housing. The governor walked right through him. He didn't even slow his pace. He simply didn't notice Marcus, as if he were a coat rack or empty space. Marcus was left standing with his hand outstretched, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto the shore. William's gaze was fixed on me. He walked straight to my seat at the head of the table, not looking at Sierra, who was frozen in horror, or the petrified guests in the room. All that could be heard was his breathing and the creak of the floorboards under his weight. He reached the table and stopped. His gaze fell upon the rich still life, the roasted duck, the salads, the fancy side dishes, the sweating carf of vodka, and then he shifted his eyes to my plate, to its pristine whiteness. Slowly, very slowly, his gaze slid to my right arm, to the coarse, hastily applied cast, from beneath which my swollen, bluish fingers peeked out. I saw his jaw clench, so hard that the muscles in his cheeks bulged. The blood drained from his face, making him frighteningly pale. It wasn't just anger. It was a quiet, terrifying rage, like a tsunami that hasn't hit the shore yet, but has already risen above the water. The room became so quiet that I could hear my father's clock ticking. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Governor William Sterling, the man feared by tycoons and criminals, did something none of the attendees could have expected. He dropped to one knee right on the hardwood floor next to my chair. His expensive suit touched the floor, but he didn't care. He was now at eye level with me. He placed the bouquet of irises on the table next to my empty plate, and, carefully, as if afraid to cause pain with his touch, covered my good hand with his warm, wide palm. His eyes, usually cold, now looked at me with such pain and tenderness that it took my breath away. He ignored everyone. Marcus, who was leaning against the wall to keep from falling. Sierra, who had her head sunk into her shoulders. Their guests. For him, in this room, there was only me. Dr. Ashworth, he said quietly, and the crystal on the table trembled from his deep voice. He looked at my empty plate, then back into my eyes. You told me you fell, he continued almost in a whisper. And in that whisper there was more threat to those around us than in any shout. But you didn't tell me you were starving. Governor Sterling slowly rose from his knee. He didn't wait for my answer. He didn't need words to understand the obvious, the tremor in my fingers, the pour of my lips, that humiliating, sucking hunger that was impossible to hide. He turned to the table. His movements were smooth, but they held a weight that made the throats of the attendees dry up. He walked to the chair. At the head of the table, the very one Marcus had been sprawling in moments ago, and placed his hand on the back. Rest. He didn't even glance at my son-in-law. He just stood there and waited. Marcus staggered, stepping back as if scalded. He gave up the seat so fast he nearly knocked over Sierra's chair. His eyes showed primal terror. He had just been unceremoniously evicted from the throne he thought was his by right of strength. The governor sat down. The chair didn't squeak beneath him. He took the seat so naturally it was as if he'd sat there all his life. He picked up a linen napkin, shook it out, and carefully spread it over his lap. Then his gaze fell on the silverware Marcus had abandoned on the tablecloth. Greasy, dirty. William Sterling distastefully nudged them aside with his pinky finger. One of the bodyguards, like a shadow, materialized next to him and placed a clean set of utensils before the governor, retrieved from somewhere deep within his tactical vest, a field kit, but gleaming steel. The silence in the room was so profound that you could hear a fly buzzing against the window pane. Marcus's guests sat with their heads bowed, trying to become invisible. They understood that they were witnessing something that was best forgotten if they wanted to save their careers. William reached for the dish of duck easily. With one hand, he pulled the heavy platter toward himself. He picked up a knife. I watched his hands. 30 years ago, those hands were the hands of a terrified young sergeant who had been brought to me with shrapnel in his Parietal lobe. Back then they trembled. Now they were solid as granite.
He cut a
Piece of meat. He didn't rip it like Marcus, but separated the fibers with surgical precision. Then he began to cut it into tiny, neat pieces. A slice, another slice. He prepared the food the way one does for small children or the critically ill. No one dared to make a sound. Marcus stood behind the governor, shifting his weight, sweat rolling down his temples and soaking into his shirt collar. Sierra sat white as chalk, fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. William finished slicing. He speared the juiciest piece of duck onto
the fork and turned to me.
There was no pity in his eyes that could have humiliated me. There was respect, deep, filial respect. He brought the fork to my lips. "Please, Dr. Ashworth," he said. Quietly, my cheeks flushed. To be fed by hand in front of people who had been laughing at my helplessness just an hour ago, it could have felt shameful.
But
there was so much dignity in William's gesture that the shame receded. I opened my mouth and accepted the food. The taste of roasted duck, savory fat, and sweet apples hit my receptors.
my
Stomach clenched in gratitude. I chewed and swallowed, feeling warmth spread through my body, restoring my strength. William waited patiently. He gave me another bite and another. Only when I had satisfied the first sharpest hunger did he set the fork down. He wiped his hands with a napkin and without turning spoke into the void of the room. So one word, but it sounded like the striking of a gong. "Which of those present?" The governor's voice was level, conversational, as if he were asking about the weather.
"Is the
Author of the lesson Dr. Ashworth received? Marcus twitched. He nervously giggled. A wet, shaky sound. "Oh, Governor Sterling, come on now," he stammered, trying to inject confidence into his voice, but breaking into a falsetto. "What lessons?" That was just a figure of speech. Family matters, domestic trifles." He took a step forward, trying to enter the governor's field of vision, but a bodyguard silently blocked his path with a shoulder. "Mama has you understand the age." Marcus tapped his finger against his temple, a gesture that made me nauseous. "She gets confused, forgets where she is. Her coordination is off. Yesterday, she went to get water at night, and he stumbled, searching for a more convincing lie. And she fell down the stairs," Marcus blurted out, seizing the convenient thought with delight. "Yes, exactly.
she
Slipped on the steps. The poor thing. We were so scared. We wanted to call an ambulance immediately, but she insisted, said, 'No need. It'll pass.' We take such good care of her, Governor Sterling. Such good care. We treat her like gold. And the cast? Well, that's just life. Old bones are fragile." A pause hung in the room. Marcus smiled, wiping his neck, confident that his lies sounded plausible. After all, it was a standard story. Old woman, stairs fall. Who would check? I swallowed the last piece of meat. The pain in my arm hadn't gone away.
But now that my brain
Had received glucose, my thoughts became crystal clear. I looked at my son-in-law, this small man who thought he was the master of life. "Marcus," I
said,
My voice was firm. He twitched, throwing a malicious glare my way, silently commanding me to be quiet. "What, Mama?" he hissed through clenched teeth, trying to maintain the mask of the caring relative. "Do you want more water?"
"There are no stairs in this
condo, Marcus," I said clearly, articulating every word. "We are on one level. There is not a single step. Even the thresholds were removed to make it easier for me to walk." The silence that followed was deafening. The smile slid off Marcus's face like melting snow. He stood frozen with his mouth open, realizing the idiocy he had just spouted. In his panic, he had forgotten the architecture of his own home, the one he was so desperate to sell. Governor Sterling stopped twirling the glass of water he held. He slowly raised his eyes to Marcus, his gaze darkened, becoming like a gun barrel.
No.
Stairs, the governor repeated very quietly. Marcus began to stutter.
Well,
I meant figuratively in the building entrance. Or, I misspoke. Governor. Sterling, stress. I worry so much about Mama. The governor slowly rose.
he was a
Head taller than Marcus. He walked right up to him, violating his personal space, forcing my son-in-law to press himself against the china cabinet. Lying to an official while they are performing their duty is an administrative violation, Marcus, William said, looking straight into his pupils. Lying to investigators is a criminal offense. He paused, letting the words sink into Marcus's mind. But lying to the woman who pulled me back from the brink of death 30 years ago, the governor's voice dropped to a whisper that made the guests break out in a cold sweat. That is a sin, Marcus. And I am a man of faith. He sharply turned away from the trembling son-in-law and looked at me again. Sierra, I commanded, not giving Marcus a chance to recover.
give.
Me my bag. My daughter flinched at the sound of her name. Why, Mama? She squeaked. Give me the bag now. Sierra, stumbling, rushed into the hallway and returned with my old worn medical bag. I nodded toward it to the governor. Open the inner pocket. Will, I requested, calling him by the name I used in the hospital ward for the first time that evening. There's something in there that will explain the nature of the staircase. William froze. His hand was near the clasp of my bag, but he didn't open it. In that moment, Marcus, realizing that silence was dragging him under, decided to go Allen. He straightened up, puffed out his chest, and tried to plaster on that authoritative arrogance that worked flawlessly on city workers and petitioners in his office. Governor Sterling, wait. The son-in-law's voice regained a shaky but brazen firmness. Let's be straight with each other, man. Man to man, official to official. He took a step forward, ignoring the tensing bodyguard, and spread his hands as if inviting the governor into a circle of the elite. I am the assistant director of city housing. Marcus pronounced the title as if it were the rank of a general. We are in the same boat, Governor Sterling. We hold this city, this region, you know how it is. Nerves, responsibility, constant stress. And here, he waved his hand carelessly in my direction as if brushing crumbs from the table. Here we're dealing with a family tragedy. Dr. Ashworth, unfortunately, age is taking its toll. Her mental state, you understand? Dementia is a terrible thing.
Sierra,
Sensing the change in her husband's tone, immediately joined the act. She nodded, and tears not of remorse, but of fear for her own well-being, glistened in her eyes. Yes, she attacks us. My daughter cried out, pointing at me with a perfectly manicured finger. You can't imagine, Governor Sterling, what it's like to live with her under one roof. She's becoming aggressive. Yesterday, she threw a vase at Marcus. We were just defending ourselves. This arm. I was trying to restrain her so she wouldn't hurt herself or us. She sobbed, smearing her mascara, turning into a grotesque mask of grief. I listened to them and felt a strange emptiness. My own daughter, my flesh and blood, stood here and slandered her mother to save the skin of her worthless husband. But instead of pain, I felt only the cold clarity of a diagnostician observing the progression of gangrene. William didn't look at them. He looked at me.
he
Waited. He didn't need excuses. He needed the truth. Sierra, I said, quietly. The room became so silent that the rustling of fabric was audible.
get.
The envelope from the bag. The one you saw this morning but were afraid to touch.
Sierra froze.
Her hand hung in
The air.
She turned a frightened look to her husband, seeking support, but Marcus was too busy trying to drill a hole in the floor with his eyes.
Do what your mother says.
William's voice cracked, like a whip. He held out my bag to her, not letting go of the handles.
With
Trembling fingers, Sierra unzipped it. She fumbled inside and pulled out a Large yellow envelope made of thick paper. The sound of her extracting it seemed deafeningly loud in the silence. What is that? Marcus nervously chuckled, though a large drop of sweat rolled down his temple. A note from the mental hospital. Proof of her incompetence. Give it here. William snatched the envelope from Sierra's weakened hands. He didn't tear it open. He carefully slid out the contents, a black and gray sheet of X-ray film. He didn't need a viewer. William raised the image high above his head, holding it up to the gleaming crystal chandelier. The light refracted through the prisms, illuminating the film and revealing the distinct whitish geometry of my bones against the black background. The fracture was clearly visible, an ugly, jagged line depicting the radius. Marcus snorted, trying to save face.
Well,
There you see. She fell just like I said. Typical fall injury. William slowly lowered the film. Now he looked at Marcus not as an official or even as a man. He looked at him as a target. I went through 2 tours in Afghanistan. Marcus, the governor said in a voice that carried the chill of the grave. I've seen men fall from trucks, from roofs, from cliffs. When a person falls, they instinctively put their hands out, palms down. The bone breaks at the wrist from compression. A call. Fracture. He tapped his finger on the X-ray right at the fracture site in the middle third of the forearm. This William took a step toward Marcus, who flinched, pressing himself against the china cabinet, making the dishes rattle. This is a diaphyseal fracture of the radius. It only occurs in one scenario, when a person covers their head with their arm to block an overhead blow from a pipe, a stick, or a very heavy fist. Marcus opened his mouth but couldn't make a sound. His lie had dissolved into dust, encountering the brutal anatomy of violence. It's a defensive fracture, William stated, throwing the X-ray onto the table, right into the bowl of creamy seafood salad. She didn't fall. She was covering up. He sharply turned his head to the left where his security chief, a tall man with a stone face, stood frozen. Major, the governor commanded, in a tone that borked no argument. Call the district attorney. I want a full audit of the assistant director of city housing's activities. Every contract, every signature, every city dollar for the past 5 years, and start with his personal accounts. Yes, sir, the major replied curtly, pulling out a radio. When do I start? The security officer clarified. William looked at Marcus, who was sliding down the wall, clutching his chest. 5 minutes ago. The words 5 minutes ago hung in the air like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. For Marcus, they meant the end. I saw. The realization cut through the alcoholic fog in his brain. An audit, a check of accounts. This wasn't just termination. It was the collapse of that entire house of cards built on bribes, kickbacks, and petty theft that he had constructed for years. Instead of surrendering, he exploded. It was the reaction of a cornered beast whose escape route had been severed. His face swelled with crimson blood. Veins on his neck bulged, turning into ugly ropes. You have no right, he bellowed, and saliva flew onto the polished tabletop. You can't do this to me.
Who are you?
You think just because you're the governor, you can do anything? He slammed his fist on the table, making the plates jump. The guests shrank into their chairs, wishing they could dissolve into the air. This is my house, Marcus roared, losing all semblance of a human being. My condo. I'm the owner here, and her? He poked a trembling finger in my direction.
She's
Nobody. She's on my charity. I feed her. I pay the electricity. I tolerate her craziness. I have rights, constitutional rights. The fear of prison squeezed the last remnants of reason out of him. Alcohol and panic created a volatile mixture, and Marcus, forgetting the armed security, forgetting who stood before him, lunged forward. He saw no one but me, the cause of all his troubles. He wanted to reach me, perhaps to strike again, to silence me, to eliminate the witness to his downfall. This is all your fault, you old witch, he shrieked, rounding the corner of the table. Sierra, covering her face with her hands, let out a thin, piercing shriek like the sound of tires screeching on wet asphalt. The bodyguards tensed. I saw the Major's hands slide toward the holster beneath his jacket, a practiced, smooth, lethal motion. But they didn't take a step. They didn't have to. Governor Sterling simply stood up. He made no sudden movements. He didn't raise his voice. He just rose to his full considerable height, straightening his broad shoulders clad in the gray wool jacket. He stood between me and the berserk Marcus, becoming an insurmountable wall. Such a wave of heavy oppressive force emanated from him that the air around him seemed to thicken. Marcus slammed into that wall and recoiled as if hitting concrete. He froze half a step from the governor, breathing heavily, clenching his fists, but not daring to raise a hand. William's eyes looked down at him with the icy calm of an executioner who has already raised the axe and is simply waiting for the command. Sit, William said quietly. It wasn't a request. It was an order given to a dog. Marcus began to tremble. All his fire was extinguished, shattered against the granite composure of my guest. He backed away, stumbled over the leg of a chair, and slumped heavily onto the floor, right onto the hardwood, clutching the edge of the tablecloth. A ringing silence settled in the room. All that could be heard was my son-in-law's wheezing breath and Sierra's quiet sobbing. I slowly caught my breath. My heart was beating
Steadily.
Now that the threat of physical violence had passed, it was time for a different kind of violence. The truth. Your house? I asked again. My voice was quiet, but in that silence, it sounded louder than a scream. Marcus lifted his blurry gaze to me. Yes, he spat out, still clinging to his illusions.
Mine legali.
Sierra is the only heir. As soon as you are gone, this will all be ours.
I
already spoke with the realtors. I need that money. Will, I wasn't looking at my son-in-law. I was looking at the governor. Please hand me the red folder, the one I asked you to bring from the archives. William nodded. He reached out to his assistant, and the man, without question, placed a thin cardboard folder with the city's official seal into his palm.
The
governor set it down before me on the table next to my empty glass. With my left hand, I opened the folder. There was only one document inside, paper with watermarks, yellowed with time over 10 years, but still possessing the legal force of steel. Marcus, I said, unfolding the document so he could see the header. You broke my arm demanding I sign a deed of gift. You threatened me. You humiliated me. You starved me for this condo. You screamed that you would sell it to cover your debts. I paused, letting him absorb every word. But you made one mistake, a rookie mistake. You never checked the property registry. You were so certain I was just an old fool clinging to four walls that you didn't even bother to order a title search. Marcus strained his neck, trying to read the text on the paper.
his eyes
Narrowed, trying to focus on the letters. What is it? He whispered. It's a deed of donation, I said with a faint smile. Dated 2014. 10 years ago. Marcus, I placed the palm of my good hand on the document.
I
Donated this condo to the City Emergency Hospital's Benevolence Board in memory of my husband and my career. The agreement has only one clause of encumbrance, the right of lifetime residency for citizen Alice Ashworth. Sierra stopped crying. She lifted her head, her mouth open in silent astonishment. Mama, she whispered, you gave the condo to the hospital? Yes, I replied, not taking my eyes off Marcus's ashen face. This condo does not belong to me, and it does not belong to Sierra. And least of all, Marcus, it never belonged to you. I watched the meaning of my words dawn on him, watching his last hope of salvation from his creditors crumble. He had not only committed a crime, he had committed a senseless crime. You beat me for a piece of paper that is worthless. I concluded, closing the folder. You fought for a ghost. Nothing here is yours except your debts. Marcus let out a sound like a whimpering beaten dog. He covered his face with his hands and rocked back and forth, sitting on the floor of the state's dining room. He understood that he didn't lose
Tonight.
he lost 10 years ago when he decided I was merely a resource to be exploited. The moan that escaped Marcus's throat didn't sound like a human voice. It was the sound of a snapped string, the sound of a bridge support collapsing. He looked at the red folder as if it were radioactive. His world built on greed and the certainty that the weak could be robbed with impunity collapsed into a single black
Point.
Suddenly, he stirred, but not to attack. All his arrogance, all his inflated importance evaporated, leaving only sticky animal fear. Marcus slid off, his spot on the hardwood completely, turning into a formless heap of expensive fabric and sweaty body.
He
Crawled toward me on all fours like a beaten dog that knows its owner has picked up a rifle. He grasped at the legs of my chair. His fingers slid on the wood, leaving wet prints. He tried to reach the hem of my dress to kiss it, but I disgustedly pulled my feet away. Dr. Ashworth, Mama, he whimpered, and tears mixed with snot streamed down his crimson face. Forgive me, for God's sake. Forgive me. I didn't know. I truly didn't know. It's all the nerves.
It's the job.
You know what kind of job I
Have.
He raised his eyes to me full of horror. They'll kill me, Mama, he whispered, his voice cracking. Those people I owe. If I don't pay the debt, tomorrow they'll cut me into pieces. I don't have the money. I hoped. Mama, save me. Ask Governor Sterling. Let him give me an extension. Let him help. I'll work it all off. I'll wash your feet. It was sickening. The man who an hour ago called me an old nag and laughed at my pain was now groveling at my feet, ready to lick my shoes.
I
Looked at the top of his head, his thinning hair matted with sweat, and felt nothing but nausea. The anger was
gone.
only disgust remained, as if I had stepped in mud. It wasn't me, he suddenly shrieked, trying to find an excuse. It was all her. It was Sierra. He pointed a finger back toward his wife, without turning. She kept egging me on. She said, the mother's old. She doesn't need the condo. Let's sell it. Let's invest. She wanted money for a new car. I just wanted peace in the family. Mama, believe me. Something clinked in the room. Sierra had dropped her fork.
I
Shifted my gaze to my daughter. She sat white as a sheet, clutching her hands to her chest. Hearing her husband's words, seeing how this sinking ship was trying to drag her down with it, she transformed. The fear in her eyes was replaced by the fury of a cornered rat. She leaped from her chair, knocking it over with a crash. What are you saying, you filth? She screamed, her voice breaking into a high-pitched squeal. How dare you? You force me. You. Sierra rushed toward me, pushing the air aside. With her hands like a swimmer, she fell to her knees next to Marcus, pushing him away with her shoulder, trying to occupy the spot closer to me, closer to the source of salvation. Mama, don't listen to him, she chattered, grabbing my good arm. Her palms were cold and clammy. He's a monster. He's a tyrant. I was afraid of him. He hit more than just you.
He threatened me.
I wanted to call an ambulance, Mommy. I swear. I reached for the phone, but he ripped out the cord. I cried all night. I wanted to help you, but he said he would kill us.
Both.
She sobbed, smearing mascara down her cheeks, turning into a grotesque mask of sorrow. I'm your daughter, Mama. Your own blood. I love you. Save me from him. Tell Governor Sterling I'm a victim. I looked at both of them.
2
Creatures crawling at my feet. One was a stranger who simply wanted money. The other was the one I carried under my heart, the one I breastfed, whose scraped knees I kissed when she was small. How did this happen? At what point did my little girl, my Sierra, Turn into this? I carefully but firmly pulled my hand out of her clutching fingers. The pain in the broken bone pulsed, reminding me of reality, preventing me from slipping into sentimentality.
See it? He sighed quietly.
She froze with hope, watching my mouth, anticipating forgiveness, expecting a mother's heart to break. You're lying, I stated. A flash of incomprehension crossed her eyes. Mama, you didn't want to call a doctor. I interrupted her, and my voice sounded sharper than a scalpel cutting through flesh.
I
Remember every minute of that night. I was lying on the floor in the hallway. I was groaning in pain. Marcus was in the kitchen drinking water.
and you.
I leaned closer to her, looking directly into her dilated pupils.
You stood over me.
You weren't crying. You leaned down and hissed in my face. Shut up, you old fool. Shut up. The neighbors will hear. You're embarrassing us. Sierra flinched, as if I had slapped her. Her mouth opened, but the words caught in her throat. The flush of shame didn't color her face. She became even paler. She understood that I remembered, that I was conscious, that the witness to her betrayal was not God, but me.
You
Weren't afraid for me. I continued ruthlessly. You were afraid of a scandal. You were afraid the neighbors would call the police, and that would hurt Marcus's career and thus your comfort. You chose comfort, Sierra, not your mother. She lowered her head. She had nothing to say. In that moment, a short, sharp vibration sounded across the polished surface of the table. Everyone flinched except for Governor Sterling. The governor calmly took his smartphone from the inner pocket of his jacket. The screen glowed with a cool bluish light reflected in his impassive
eyes.
He swiped his finger across the screen, reading a message. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly upward, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of a surgeon who has confirmed a fatal diagnosis. The audit works fast, he said dryly, not lifting his eyes from the screen. In our time, digital footprints are harder to wash away than blood. He slowly placed the phone on the table and looked at Marcus, who had fallen silent, sensing the approach of the end. It turns out, Marcus, your debt problems are just the tip of the iceberg. The governor's voice sounded almost bored, but in that boredom was a threat. My people didn't just check your count. They checked the properties under your jurisdiction, including the basement of this very building, a building that is a recognized architectural landmark. Marcus stopped breathing. His eyes bulged out of their sockets. It seemed the mention of the basement frightened him more than the broken arm of his mother-in-law. Interesting case, William continued, tapping his finger on the table. According to the documents, it's a storage area for cleaning supplies. But in fact, my guys are down there now. They say there are so many crates of confiscated goods, you could open a small illegal market, counterfeit liquor, untaxed cigarettes, contraband, Marcus. The governor shook his head like a disappointed teacher. You didn't just beat a veteran of labor. You used the basement of the building where the woman who saved my life resides as a warehouse for your dirty business. You turned her home into a den of thieves. William Sterling raised his gaze to his security
Chief.
The major nodded. He didn't need additional instructions.
2 bodyguards
Stepped forward. They moved synchronously, like parts of a single mechanism. Marcus didn't even have time to shriek. Strong hands in black gloves jerked him up from his knees. He tried to squirm, but he was restrained so professionally and harshly that the crunch of his joints could be heard. No, Governor Sterling. Let's make a deal, Marcus wailed, writhing in the steel grip. I'll tell you everything. I'll turn in the suppliers. Don't remove this trash, the governor said quietly, turning away to the window. The bodyguards dragged Marcus toward the exit. They didn't use ceremony. His feet scraped the hardwood floor, kicking up the rugs. He screamed, begged, and threatened, but his cries were just noise that receded. The door to the hallway was open. The very door he had so proudly thrown open 10 minutes ago, expecting to see his accomplice. Now he was being hauled through it like the criminal he had always been, only before his suit had concealed it.
Sier, du.
Something came his last cry from the foyer. Then the front door slammed shut, the heavy oak door. The sound was final, like a judge's gavel. The condo was silent again, but it was no longer the oppressive, sticky silence that had reigned here for the last few years.
It
Was a clean, cool silence, the kind found in an operating room after a successful heavy multi-hour surgery.
when
The lights dim and the patient is wheeled away to the recovery room. A life was saved. The worst was over. William's assistants worked quickly and silently. While we spoke, they cleared the dirty plates, the remnants of the ravaged duck, and the spilled wine stains from the table. The windows were thrown open wide, letting in the fresh night air, airing out the smell of stale liquor and Marcus' cheap cologne.
we
Were left alone, me and the boy I had once saved, now a gray-haired man, bearing the weight of an entire region on his shoulders. We sat at a clean table. Before us were only two thin porcelain cups, from which steam rose, and a saucer with thinly sliced lemon. The tea was strong, real, amber-colored. My right arm in its cast lay in my lap. The painkiller was beginning to wear off, and the dull, throbbing ache returned, reminding me of the price I had paid for this evening. But this pain was different. It was the pain of healing, not the pain of destruction.
I
Felt incredibly light, as if a lead apron I had worn for years had been lifted from my shoulders. William took a sip of tea and looked at me over the cup. Dr. Rashworth, he asked softly, "Is there anything you need? I can send a nurse. I can arrange a transfer to the best suite in the regional hospital. Money, medication, security, just say the word." I looked at him. In his eyes, I saw a sincere willingness to turn the world upside down for me. But I didn't need the world. I needed to reclaim myself. I looked at the center of the table. There on a small platter rested the only untouched item from that barbaric feast, a slice of chocolate layer cake, layered, soaked with frosting. It stood like a small monument. Next to it lay a silver dessert fork. "Only one thing," Will I said, smiling genuinely for the first time that evening. The governor tensed, ready to fulfill any request. "The fork," I said. He blinked, clearly confused. "The fork?" he repeated, looking around the table. "Should I serve you the silverware? I'll call someone now."
no.
I shook my head. "Just slide it closer to me." William, still not understanding, cautiously moved the saucer with the cake and the fork closer to my edge of the table. I looked at my right arm, encased in plaster, useless, immobile. The very one Marcus had laughed at me for, calling me a former colleague, unable even to feed herself. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my left hand, my non-dominant hand. My fingers trembled slightly, a sign of age, and the stress I'd endured. But I forced them to obey. I picked up the silver fork. It rested in my palm, awkwardly, uncomfortably, but firmly. Marcus said I couldn't hold it. I said quietly, looking at the gleam of the silver, that I was helpless, that without him I would starve to death in front of a full
plate.
I looked at William. I need to prove him wrong. Even if he can't see it, I need to prove it to myself. I lowered the fork to the cake with my left hand, clumsily but resolutely.
I
Broke off a piece, brought it to my mouth. The frosting was sweet. The layers melted on my tongue. It was the most delicious cake of my life because I was eating it myself in my home at my table without fear. "I am not helpless, Will," I said, swallowing the bite and feeling strength return to me. "I am a surgeon. I was just waiting for the necessity of the operation to ripen."
I
Set the fork down and looked into the dark window where the lights of the big city burned. Sometimes for the organism to survive, the diseased part must be amputated, even if it hurts, even if it's part of the family. I was
just
waiting for the right assistant to cut out the rot. Governor Sterling silently covered my good hand with his palm.
We.
Drank tea, and my husband's clock ticked off the time of my new free life. Tick-tock, tick-tock. My dear listeners, that is the end of Dr. Alice Ashworth's story. A story about how long a strong woman can endure, and how terrifying retribution can be when the cup of patience finally overflows. I know many of you have mixed feelings right now. Some will say they deserved it. They got what was coming to them. And others might think, was it too cruel? After all, Sierra is her daughter, her own flesh and blood. Is it right to cast out your own child into the unknown, to hand your son-in-law over to the court? This is the eternal
Question.
Where does family obligation end and the right to one's own dignity begin? Does a parent have the right to sever themselves from children if those children turn into parasites who threaten their very life? I, Alice, made my choice. I chose life. How would you have acted in my place? Could you forgive Sierra? Let me know in the comments. Your opinion truly matters to me. And be sure to tell us which city or country you're listening from. The geography of our stories is truly astounding. If this story touched you, if it made your heart beat faster, please support our channel by hitting the like button, subscribing, and clicking the bell to make sure you don't miss new stories. Your support is what inspires us to create. We wish you all the best. At the end of this video, a window will appear in the center of the screen. Click on it to watch our other most gripping stories. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.